Imagine stumbling into a forest at night, its branches clawing the sky like the hands of ghosts, where silence presses so hard against your chest you can hear your own fear in every heartbeat. Now imagine you're a girl with nothing, no family, no name anyone cares to remember, yet you see the faint prints of a lost child leading into that darkness. Do you follow, knowing you might vanish too? Stay with me, because what happens in this story is something you'll never forget. An orphan girl who had been abandoned by the world will step into a wilderness no one dared to enter, track a missing native boy, and face not just the dangers of the wild but the shadows of her own past. And by dawn, before a fire-lit circle of elders, she will be crowned a hero in a way that will shake you to your core. Before we dive in, hit that subscribe button right now, especially if you're in the US or the UK, because these are the stories that grip your soul, stories that will keep you awake at night asking yourself, would I have been brave enough to do the same? The night pressed heavy over the settlement like a blanket that refused to breathe. The rain had ended hours ago, leaving behind the sticky scent of earth and pine, a dampness that clung to clothes and skin alike. The orphan girl, Alara, sat alone near the edge of the encampment, a thin figure hunched close to the dying glow of her own small fire, one she had coaxed to life with more stubbornness than skill. She was used to being unnoticed. Most nights no one cared where she slept, whether under the trees or tucked against an abandoned cart, as long as she stayed out of the way. Being invisible had long ago become her shield. But on this night, voices carried across the camp. The hunters, rough men with shoulders wide from years of carrying rifles and pelts, speaking in low, careless tones. Alara had not meant to listen, but when survival is your only compass, you learn to hear things others ignore. Their words floated on the damp air. The boy wandered off. Can't have gotten far, the woods will deal with him. Then laughter. Cruel, dismissive, the kind that rattled something deep inside her chest. They spoke of a child from the native village beyond the ridge, gone since evening, last seen chasing a dog into the tree line. The search had ended before it even began. The forest, they said, was too deep, too old. No one goes in after dark. If the boy wasn't back by morning, he was gone. Just another whisper swallowed by the trees. Elara's jaw tightened. She pulled her threadbare shawl closer around her shoulders, though the night was not especially cold. She knew what it was to vanish and have no one come. She had once been that child, crying in the dark, waiting for footsteps that never returned. A girl left on a doorstep with no name, but the one the matron had scribbled into the records, raised in the shadows of pity and impatience until even pity dried up. No family, no claim, no one to come searching. And now here she sat, listening to grown men laugh while a mother somewhere wept. She didn't decide to rise, her body simply moved. She slipped from the fire's glow, her feet carrying her to the forest's edge, as though pulled by an invisible thread. The hunter's talk still rang in her ears, their indifference a wound she couldn't ignore. If no one else would follow, she would. She had no weapon but her will, no tools but her eyes and hands. Yet she had something the men had long since lost. The sharpness that comes from living every day on the edge of hunger. She could see what others missed. She could listen to the earth. At the tree line, she crouched low. The soil was soft, dark with rain, and there, just as her gut had hoped, were prints. Small, bare, to spread wide as if the child had been running. She traced them with her fingertips, and a strange fire lit inside her chest. He was alive, he was moving, and she would follow. The forest swallowed her quickly. Branches reached low, snagging her tangled hair. Shadows stretched tall and twisting, and every sound felt louder than it should have been. The drip of water, the crackle of leaves beneath her feet, the call of an owl somewhere above. But Alara pressed on. Step by step she followed the trail, every bent blade of grass, every smear of mud. She whispered to herself as she went, not prayers exactly. She had long given up believing anyone listened, but promises, I'll find you. I won't leave you. Not like they left me. The night deepened. Once she thought she heard a sob, faint and fragile, drifting through the trees. But when she stilled her breath to listen, only silence remained. Another time she spotted movement. A fox, its eyes glowing briefly in the dark before vanishing. Hours stretched like years, and her legs ached, her belly hollow with hunger, but the footprints kept appearing, and so did her resolve. Just before the horizon hinted at light, her hand brushed against something caught in a thorn bush. She froze. A scrap of cloth, frayed at the edges, threaded with beads. Not like the hunter's clothes. This was delicate, handmade, carrying the care of a mother's hands. The boy's. Her throat closed, tears pricking her eyes, but she pressed them back. She held the scrap against her chest and whispered, "Hold on, I'm coming." And as the first pale fingers of dawn reached through the treetops, the forest around her shifted. The trees groaned like old bones. The air thickened, and for the first time Elara felt not alone. Something else was moving in those woods. Watching, waiting. Elara's fingers trembled as she tucked the beaded cloth scrap into her pocket, her breath clouding in the cool dawn air. The forest loomed around her like a cathedral, branches knitting so thickly overhead that the early light only trickled through in broken shafts, dusting the ground with pale gold. She was deep enough now that she could no longer hear the distant crackle of the hunters' fires or the occasional bark of dogs from the camp. Here, the silence was alive. Every creak of a branch, every rustle of leaves, every sudden flutter of wings felt like a voice whispering in a language she could almost, but not quite, understand. She crouched low again, searching for the trail. There it was, bare feet pressing into soft earth, the toes dug in harder now, as though the boy had been running. Elara ran her fingertips lightly over one of the impressions, frowning. The print was fresher than before, edges sharp, not yet softened by breeze or falling leaves. He wasn't far. Her heart leapt, a mixture of relief and dread. Relief that he lived, dread at what might be driving him further into the trees. "Hey," she whispered into the vast stillness, her voice rough from disuse. "I know you're scared, but I'm here. I'll find you." She didn't know why she spoke aloud. The boy couldn't hear her yet, and no one else was listening. Maybe she said it to convince herself. The ground changed as she moved forward. Where once the prints had been clean, now the boy's path tangled into confusion. Circles of trampled grass, half prints overlapping each other, as if he had spun around or darted in panicked directions before choosing one. Elara's stomach tightened. She could almost feel his fear lingering in the disturbed earth. She crouched lower, examining broken twigs and crushed leaves, piecing the story together like a puzzle only she could solve. He had hesitated. He had run. Something had frightened him, and then she saw it. Not a footprint, not a broken branch, but a carving in the bark of a nearby tree. A spiral etched deep, not with the clumsy hand of a child, but with deliberate force. She froze, reaching out to trace it with her fingertip. It felt old, older than her, older than the hunters, maybe even older than the village itself. She looked around and saw more, symbols scratched into trunks, faint in some places, darker in others, spirals, lines, shapes that prickled unease across her skin. Warnings, markers, something. Her breath quickened. "What is this place?" she muttered. The wind stirred, carrying with it something that wasn't quite sound, but wasn't silence either. A low hum, like voices chanting far away, rising and falling with the rhythm of breath. Elara's pulse spiked. She turned in a circle, searching for the source, but it seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Don't lose it," she whispered to herself, pressing a hand to her chest. "Don't lose your head." She forced her eyes back to the ground. The footprints stretched on. She followed them, step after step, deeper into the belly of the woods. But now her senses were sharper, every rustle making her flinch. Twice she thought she saw movement in the corner of her eye. Something low to the ground, dark and fast. But when she whipped her head toward it, there was nothing. Just the heavy hush of the trees. The deeper she went, the more the forest seemed to thicken. The air grew heavier, damp with mist that clung to her skin, beading in her tangled hair. Her hunger gnawed at her belly, but she shoved it down. Hunger, she understood. She had survived nights of worse. It was the other feeling she couldn't tame, the crawling sensation that unseen eyes watched her every move. At one point she paused, leaning against a mossy trunk to catch her breath, and whispered again, though now her voice trembled. "You're not alone, little one. I swear I'll bring you back. Just hold on." Then her foot brushed against something half buried at the root of the tree. She knelt, brushing away damp leaves, and uncovered it. A necklace strung with small beads carved from bone, the string frayed as though ripped in a struggle. Her breath hitched. She lifted it carefully, heart pounding. This was no scrap of cloth. This was personal precious. Proof he had been here. Before she could savor the relief, a sound ripped through the stillness. A low, guttural growl, deep enough to vibrate in her bones. Elara froze, the necklace clutched tight in her fist. Slowly, painfully, she turned her head. From the shadows between the trees it emerged, a wolf, larger than any she had ever seen, its fur black as pitch, its eyes gleaming amber in the dim light. Its lips curled back, teeth bared, a rumble building in its throat like thunder preparing to break. Elara's stomach dropped. She knew wolves. She had seen them from afar, stalking the edges of camps, but this was no curious scavenger. This was a predator, and she had trespassed into its domain. Her mind screamed at her to run, but her body remembered the footprints. If she bolted, she would lose the trail worse. She would never outrun the beast. So she stayed. Every muscle taut, her breath shallow. Her eyes locked on its eyes, refusing to break contact though terror clawed at her chest. "Easy," she whispered, voice so thin it was barely sound. "I don't want to fight. I just want the boy." The wolf padded forward, slow, deliberate, each step soundless but heavy with intent. Elara's knees shook. She thought of all the times she had nearly starved, of the nights curled in doorways with nothing but rags, of being told she was nothing. Was this how it ended? Alone in the woods, her bones left for scavengers, the boy lost forever. Then, from somewhere deeper in the forest, a sound cut through the tension. A voice. High, thin, trembling, but singing, a child's voice. The wolf froze mid-step, its ears flicked. The growl ceased, though its teeth still gleamed. For one long, breathless moment, predator and girl both listened. The song wavered through the trees, ancient and haunting, carrying a rhythm that seemed to pulse with the forest itself. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the wolf turned. With a low, rumbling snarl, it slinked back into the shadows, vanishing as though it had never been there. Elara collapsed to her knees, gasping, her hands shaking violently around the necklace. She pressed it against her chest, whispering, "Thank you, whoever you are. Thank you." But even as relief swept through her, she knew the truth. This was no simple search anymore. Something beyond flesh and blood was at work here, something that had called the boy deeper into the woods. And now it had called her, too. Elara stayed on her knees longer than she meant to, her breath coming in ragged gasps, the echoes of the wolf's growl still reverberating through her chest like distant thunder. And though it had vanished, the knowledge of how close death had crept left her trembling so hard, she thought her bones might rattle apart. Yet even in the midst of her fear she clung to the bone, bead necklace like a lifeline, pressing the smooth carvings into her palm until they bit her skin, reminding her that she had come too far to stop now, that the boy was still out there. So she forced herself upright, every muscle taut with the memory of teeth and amber eyes, and turned her ear toward the sound that had saved her. The song, faint but still drifting through the trees, high and unsteady yet, somehow carrying a strength that felt older than any child should know. And without allowing herself another moment of hesitation, she pushed forward, stumbling over roots, sliding down damp slopes, her lungs burning, her heart hammering with a strange mix of dread and hope, until at last she broke through a thicket of brambles and saw him, a boy no older than 7, barefoot and thin, his dark hair plastered to his cheeks with mist, standing alone in a shaft of pale morning light that pierced the canopy like a spotlight, his small face streaked with dried tears but his eyes startlingly calm, almost too calm. And in his hands he held nothing, no stick for defense, no trinket for comfort, only his own voice, which wavered into silence the moment he saw her. Elara stopped dead, afraid to breathe, afraid that any sudden movement would scatter this fragile moment like smoke, and for a heartbeat they simply stared at each other. Her, ragged and bloodied, a stranger with desperation carved into every line of her face, and him, a child both terrified and strangely serene, as though he stood in two worlds at once. Then he tilted his head, his eyes wide and dark, and whispered something in a tongue she did not know, soft and melodic, words shaped like the wind through pine needles. Elara's throat tightened, and though she could not understand, she whispered back, voice trembling, "It's all right, I'm here for you. I'll take you home." She stretched out a hand, palm open, and for a long, heart-wrenching moment he did not move, did not blink, only watched her with that strange, steady gaze that made her skin prickle, as though he saw not her face but something deeper, something inside her. Finally, with a slowness that made her heart ache, he stepped forward and placed his tiny hand in hers. His skin warmed despite the chill air, and the touch nearly undid her, tears rising unbidden, because it had been so long since anyone had chosen to reach for her. But the moment was not gentle for long, for as soon as his fingers curled into hers, the forest shifted again, the shadows seeming to lean closer, the air tightening with an invisible pressure, and Elara felt it in her bones. This boy had not simply wandered, he had been called, drawn into a trial that was no accident, and by taking his hand she had entered it with him. Still, she clenched her jaw, whispering, "I've got you," as though saying it aloud might make it true, and lifted him into her arms, his small frame light against her chest, yet heavy with a weight she could not name. And as she turned back toward the path, she realized that saving him would mean more than just finding the way out. She would have to stand against whatever ancient will had lured him here, and whether the forest would allow them to leave together was a question that hung sharp and unanswered in the hush of the trees. Elara carried the boy in silence, each step a battle against the tremor in her legs and the weight in her chest. But though his body was light as air, the space around them seemed to grow heavier. The trees crowding closer, their trunks leaning as though to block her path, the mist thickening until it curled around her ankles like cold fingers pulling her down. And then she noticed the voices, first faint, like a murmur just beneath the threshold of hearing, then louder, a cacophony of whispers layered over one another, some coaxing, some mocking, some sounding like children crying, others like women weeping, and in their tangled chorus she began to hear words, cutting, cruel words she had known all her life. "No one wanted you. You were thrown away. You are nothing. You will always be nothing." And her chest squeezed so tightly she nearly staggered. She wanted to cover her ears but could not because her arms held the boy. So instead she bit down on her lip until she tasted blood, forcing herself to keep walking. Yet with each step the voices pressed harder, until the trees opened suddenly into a clearing ringed with great stones, each one carved with glowing symbols that pulsed faintly like the heartbeat of the earth. And the boy slipped from her arms, standing in the center of the circle as if guided by unseen hands, his eyes reflecting the eerie light. Elara tried to follow, but the moment her foot crossed the circle's edge a force slammed into her chest, invisible but crushing, and visions exploded behind her eyes. Memories of her childhood, sharper and crueler than she remembered the cold night she was left on the orphanage steps, her small fists pounding against the locked door, her voice hoarse from crying, the matron's hard face when she said there would be no one coming back, the other children whispering, unwanted. Behind her back, winters where hunger gnawed so hard she stole bread only to be beaten for it, nights curled alone while the world moved on without her, each moment dragged to the surface, raw and merciless, and Elara sank to her knees, gasping, tears streaking her dirt-smeared face as she whispered, "Why are you showing me this? I've already lived it, isn't it enough?" But the voices only grew sharper, the whispers coiling like knives, until she realized the forest was not tormenting her for cruelty's sake. It was testing her, forcing her to face the shadow she carried, to decide whether she would let it break her or rise beyond it. And through the storm of visions, she saw the boy watching her, silent, waiting, as if her survival depended not on her strength alone, but on her willingness to choose hope. For a long, shuddering moment she nearly surrendered, the old voice inside her hissing that she was still that abandoned child, still nothing, but then a spark ignited in her chest. Faint, trembling, but real, as she remembered the boy's hand slipping into hers, the warmth of that small trust, and the promise she had whispered, "I won't leave you." With a cry that tore from the pit of her soul, Elara forced herself to her feet, her legs quaking, and declared into the choking mist, "I am not nothing. I may have been left behind, but I will not leave him. I will not leave anyone lost in the dark." The words rang out, sharp and defiant, and the whispers faltered, then fractured, splintering into silence as the mist shuddered and withdrew, the glowing runes on the stones flaring brilliantly before dimming to calm, and the weight on her chest lifted until she could breathe again, the air suddenly cool and sweet. The boy smiled then, faint but clear, and walked back to her, slipping his hand into hers once more, and she knew in that instant the trial had not been about him at all. It had been about her, and she had been chosen, whether by the spirits of the forest or by fate itself, to prove that even those the world had cast aside could carry a strength greater than bloodlines or names. Yet though the circle lay quiet, she sensed this was only the beginning, for the forest had released them, but the tribe still waited, and their judgment might be harsher than anything the spirits had shown her. The forest did not release them easily, for though the mist had thinned, and the crushing whispers had fallen silent, the path back seemed to twist and change with every step, trees shifting in the half, light as if determined to confuse her, roots snaring at her ankles, branches tugging at her hair. Yet Elara pressed forward with the boy's small hand gripping hers, his calmness anchoring her even as exhaustion dragged at her body, and with every step she whispered encouragement, not just for him, but for herself too. Words like, "just a little farther," and "we're going home," clinging to the hope that home was not just an idea for others but something she too might one day find. And slowly, painfully, the dark veil of night began to lift, the black sky softening into deep blue, then violet, until the first blush of gold spilled across the treetops, and with it came the sound of distant drums, faint but steady, a rhythm that stirred something in her chest. Guiding her steps like a beacon, she followed the sound, her heart quickening, until at last the trees broke open and she stumbled into a wide clearing at the edge of the village, her legs nearly giving way as she saw them. Dozens of figures already gathered, men, women, and children of the tribe, their faces streaked with worry and fatigue, many clutching torches that guttered in the dawn wind, their eyes fixed on the forest's edge, as though they had been waiting all night for a miracle that might never come. And when they saw her, carrying their lost child by the hand, a collective cry rose, a sound of relief, disbelief, and something deeper, almost reverent. The boy's mother broke from the crowd first, her long braids flying behind her as she ran, tears streaming freely, falling to her knees before her son, clutching him against her chest as though she might never let him go again, sobbing words in their tongue that Elara could not understand but felt in the marrow of her bones. And though the child smiled through his own tears, pointing back toward Elara as if to say she was the reason he had come home, all eyes soon shifted toward her, and she felt suddenly exposed, her ragged clothes torn and stained with blood and mud, her face hollow from sleepless nights and the trial she had endured, and for a heartbeat she feared rejection, that they would see only a stranger, an orphan with no place, someone who had trespassed into sacred ground. But then the elder stepped forward, tall and weathered, his hair white as snow, his gaze sharp but kind, and in the rising light he raised his staff and spoke in a voice that carried like thunder, words that the others echoed, their tone rising with each phrase. And though Elara did not understand the language, she felt the meaning sink into her heart. They were naming her, not as outsider, not as orphan, but as something new, protector, hero, one who had been tested and had not faltered. The boy's mother approached her then, placing a necklace of carved bones and feathers over her head, the weight of it resting warm against her chest. And though her hands trembled, she did not shrink away, for in that moment she felt something she had never felt in her life. Not pity, not mere survival, but belonging, true belonging, as if the forest had stripped her bare and the tribe now clothed her anew. The drums thundered louder, voices rose in chant, and as the first full light of dawn broke over the clearing, washing her in gold, the elder lifted her hand high and crowned her with a circlet woven from cedar and wildflowers, its fragrance sharp and alive, declaring her before all as the girl who had walked into the heart of the forest, faced its darkness, and returned with the lost child safe in her arms, a hero not by birthright but by choice. And though tears blurred her vision, Elora lifted her chin, letting the warmth of their acceptance wash over her, whispering silently to the child within her who had always believed she was unwanted. You were wrong. You were always meant for this. And as the tribe song swelled to meet the sunrise, she knew her journey was not ending here. It was only beginning, for she was no longer just the orphan girl. She was the guardian of light born from the forest shadows, and her story was now forever bound to theirs.